Thanks very much for being with us today at the roundtable. Just a few words about your work. You've been working on private sector issues and public sector issues, but always with the common thread of performance management. So, some reflections on what one sector can learn from the other?
So there's this big trend going on in public sector where people say government should be run more efficient like a business, and what can we learn and adopt from the private sector. But so far I've noticed that particularly when it comes to performance management, the private sector can actually learn quite a bit from the public sector. For instance, in the public sector, people are far more comfortable with transparency and are far more not only comfortable with it, but also are far more willing to actively embrace and adopt transparency much above the bar that would be legally there. So really actively, proactively embrace it. The second thing is that public sector, more than private sector, is aimed on fulfilling a certain mission. So it really is about something. So system goals, what you would see in the private sector, which is about, so how am I doing my job, how am I spending my budget and my resources. The public sector is far more used to working with mission goals, which is what it is to achieve for the citizens. So I think those are two things that the private sector can really learn from the public sector. Conversely, trends about better planning and budgeting and forecasting, there's been a bit of a hype in around 2004, if I'm not mistaken, around a very controversial and provocative methodology such as the beyond budgeting methodology. That was mainly driven by the private sector, and I think that that's an area, planning and budgeting, where public sector can learn quite a bit from private.
Okay, so but what is this thing about the stakeholders? Why do stakeholders matter so much? I mean, after all, in the private sector you have shareholders, in the public sector you've got politicians. Is that not enough?
No, definitely not enough. In fact, we sometimes forget that in the private sector the idea of the shareholder focus is actually rather new. It's only been there for the last 30 or 40 years. In the hundreds of years beforehand, business was as stakeholder driven as public sector. In fact, religion, business and government were completely mixed up. In the city where I live, in the Middle Ages, I think in 1500 and something, there was something called the guild letter, in which 23 guilds were allowed in the city, and each guild would also be responsible for the safety of a part of the city walls. So safe city walls would lead to what we now call higher consumer confidence. Higher consumer confidence would lead to more people being attracted to the local markets, and more people attracted to the local market would be good for the economy, which could be invested in more security. The pure stakeholder approach is only in the last 30, 40 years that we tend to focus on shareholders.
But is the emphasis on stakeholders something that is going to last for you, or is it more like a fad? It's something that we're getting excited about now, but then in the end we'll go back to the shareholder paradigm and the political paradigm, just responding to what central government tells you to do?
No, I think it is the other way around. It's the shareholder focus and the political focus that is the fad, and we need to go back to normal, which has for hundreds of years has been focus on the stakeholders. In fact, in public sector, stakeholder focus is the absolute core of the concept that we call democracy. Democracy is not about voting. Democracy is about taking the needs and requirements of as many stakeholders as possible into account.
How does this reflect, though, in the performance measurement and management methodologies that we have? I mean, after all, can this be accommodated in the scorecards that we use or the dashboards that we use?
Now, most of the work in performance management has been driven very much by agency theory, which is about the shareholder being central. But there's actually one methodology that focuses quite a bit on stakeholder approach, which is called the performance prism, that you should be well aware of, as it comes from Cranfield. That deserves much more attention than it currently gets, because I think that is a huge step forward.